You've been in this situation before. A normal conversation. Nothing unusual. No tension. No warning signs. But later, you replay it in your mind because something about it feels off. Not enough to explain it, but enough to make you question it. You didn't get forced. No one pressured you directly. No obvious manipulation you could point at. And yet, you still ended up agreeing to something you didn't fully plan for, or shifting your opinion without noticing when it happened, or walking away feeling like the outcome somehow benefited the other side more than you expected. And that's where it gets confusing, because on the surface, everything looked completely normal. So here's the real question. If nothing obvious happened, why did your decision still change? And more importantly, who actually shaped that outcome? Here's what most people never realize. Human decisions are not usually directed. They are guided, quietly, through patterns you don't consciously notice. Patterns in timing, patterns in attention, patterns in emotion, and patterns in how information is framed inside a conversation. And because these patterns don't look like control, your mind labels everything as my choice. But once you start noticing how this actually works, something changes permanently. You stop reacting to situations after they happen and start recognizing the structure while it is unfolding. Not later, not after reflection, but in real time. And in this video, you are going to see exactly how that works.
Step by step. And once you understand it, you will start noticing things in everyday conversations that you were completely blind to before. Let's begin. The first interpretation silently defines everything. In almost every situation, you don't process reality from zero. Your mind immediately grabs the first explanation that feels complete enough. Not the most accurate, not the most logical, just the first one that fits. And the moment that happens, something important changes. You stop questioning the situation deeply and start building everything around that first version. Even new information doesn't replace it. It just gets adjusted to support it. That's why two people can experience the same moment and walk away with completely different conclusions. Because they didn't just see different details. They locked onto different interpretations first. And whoever sets that first interpretation quietly controls the direction of understanding. Not through force, but through timing. Because in human perception, first meaning becomes default meaning. Attention decides what becomes real in your mind. Nothing feels important without attention. Not truth, not logic, not even reality. Attention is what gives something weight in your mind. Whatever you focus on starts expanding automatically. It becomes more significant, more emotional, more urgent, even if objectively it isn't. And whatever loses your attention starts disappearing from importance, even if it actually matters more. This is why two people can go through the same situation and remember it completely differently. They didn't live different events. They allocated attention differently inside the same event. And here's what most people never realize. Attention is not fully controlled by you. It is constantly influenced by tone, by framing, by pauses, by what is emphasized and what is quietly ignored. So influence doesn't always change what you think. It changes what you notice first. And once attention locks in, your mind builds meaning automatically around it. Silence creates pressure without a single word. Most people are uncomfortable with silence because silence feels unnatural in conversation. It feels like something is missing. So when silence appears, people rush to fix it. They talk, they explain, they justify. And in doing so, they often reveal more than they intended. Not because someone forced them, but because silence created internal pressure. And that pressure demands release. Experienced communicators understand this deeply. They don't rush to fill silence. They let it sit. Because silence doesn't just pause conversation.
It shifts psychological control. Whoever stays calm inside silence controls the emotional temperature of the moment, and the other person usually reacts to that temperature without even realizing it. 4. Ownership makes people defend ideas automatically. If you tell someone what to believe, they will often resist it, even if it's correct. But if they feel like they arrived at it themselves, something completely different happens. They protect it, they defend it, they repeat it, even emotionally, because the mind doesn't prioritize accuracy first. It prioritizes ownership. Once an idea feels like mine, it stops being information. It becomes identity. And identity is not debated. It is defended automatically, without conscious effort. That's why direct persuasion often fails, but indirect realization sticks permanently, because one feels imposed and the other feels self-created. 5. Speed removes depth from thinking. When situations move fast, your mind loses processing depth. It shifts from analysis to reaction, and reaction is always shallow compared to reflection. Urgency doesn't just push decisions. It compresses thinking. It reduces options. It forces closure before full understanding develops. And in that state, people don't choose the best option. They choose the fastest available escape from pressure, which later feels like their decision. But in reality, it was a speed-controlled reaction. And once you recognize this, you start noticing how often urgency is used, not to help you decide, but to prevent you from thinking. 6. Hidden capability avoids early resistance. Visible strength creates opposition. People prepare for it. They react to it. They challenge it. But hidden capability doesn't trigger early defense because it is not fully seen. And what is not fully seen is not fully guarded against. That creates a gap between expectation and reality. And that gap is where outcomes shift. Because underestimated people operate without early resistance from others. And by the time their capability becomes visible, the situation has already changed. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. The loudest person in the room usually gets everyone's attention. They're confident. They're expressive. They make sure people know exactly what they're capable of. And because everyone sees them coming, everyone adjusts around them. People prepare. People become cautious. People pay attention. But the quiet person, the one nobody is watching, the one who doesn't feel the need to constantly prove themselves, most people barely notice them. And that's exactly why they become dangerous to underestimate. Human beings don't react to actual capability. They react to perceived capability. That's a very important distinction, because perception creates preparation, and preparation creates resistance. The less resistance someone encounters, the easier it becomes for them to influence outcomes. History is full of examples of this. Individuals, organizations, entire nations, winning simply because they were underestimated, not because they were stronger, but because nobody took them seriously until it was too late. And the same principle appears in conversations, in workplaces, in social circles. People reveal less, expect less resistance, and often achieve more because nobody was paying attention early enough. The lesson isn't to hide who you are. The lesson is to stop feeling the need to constantly advertise your strengths, because sometimes the strongest position is the one nobody notices until it matters. 7. Emotion decides whether logic is even heard. Most people believe decisions are driven by logic, but psychology shows something very different. Before logic gets processed, emotion gets processed first, always. Think about the last time someone tried to convince you of something while you were angry. Maybe their argument made sense. Maybe they were completely right, but it didn't matter because you weren't evaluating the information. You were reacting to the emotion. And this happens constantly. People imagine conversations are battles of ideas, when in reality, they are often battles of emotional states. A defensive person doesn't hear information the same way a relaxed person does. A fearful person doesn't process information the same way a confident person does. The facts may be identical. The interpretation changes. Because emotion acts like a filter. Everything passes through it first. And once you understand that, a lot of human behavior suddenly starts making sense. Arguments that should work. A lot of human behavior suddenly starts making sense. Arguments that should work fail. Advice that should help gets rejected. Not because the information was wrong, but because the emotional conditions were wrong. This is why skilled communicators focus on emotional atmosphere before they focus on persuasion. They understand a simple truth. People rarely accept information when they feel threatened, but when they feel understood, they become far more open. The mind opens after the emotions settle. But when they feel understood, they become far more open. The mind opens after the emotions settle, not before. And the people who understand that often appear incredibly persuasive, not because they have better arguments, but because they understand when arguments can actually be heard. 8. The illusion of choice creates cooperation. Human beings value freedom, not just actual freedom, the feeling of freedom. And that feeling shapes behavior more than most people realize. When people feel forced, they resist, even when the outcome benefits them. But when people feel like they chose something themselves, they become committed to it, even when the outcome is exactly the same. This creates one of the most powerful psychological patterns in human interaction, the illusion of choice. Imagine someone asks, "Would you rather do this today or tomorrow?" At first glance, that sounds like a choice. But look closer. The decision isn't whether you'll do it. The decision is only when. The larger outcome was already assumed. And this happens everywhere. In conversations, in relationships, in business, in leadership. The options feel open, but the structure was already built beforehand. And because the structure remains invisible, people focus on selecting, not questioning. That's the real power of framing. The frame determines what feels possible. And most people never notice the frame. They only notice the options inside it, which means the biggest influence often happens before the decision itself ever begins. 9. Absence changes perception more than presence. Most people believe value comes from being constantly present, always available, always responding, always showing up. And while consistency matters, there's another psychological principle working underneath it, something far more powerful. Human beings adapt to what becomes predictable, no matter how valuable it is. The more consistently something is available, the less consciously it gets noticed, not because it lost value, but because the brain became familiar with it. And familiarity has a strange effect. It reduces awareness. Think about the people you see every day, the things you use every day, the opportunities that are always there. You rarely think about them, not because they aren't important, but because your mind assumes they'll still be there tomorrow. And that's where absence changes everything. The moment something becomes less available, attention returns. People start noticing. People start remembering. People start comparing the present moment to what used to be there. And that comparison creates value, not because the thing itself changed, but because perception changed. The human mind notices contrast, not consistency. That's why absence often feels more powerful than presence, because presence becomes normal. That's why absence often feels more powerful than presence, because presence becomes normal. Absence becomes noticeable. And what becomes noticeable becomes psychologically important. You can see this everywhere. Friendships, relationships, workplaces, social circles. Sometimes a person's value isn't fully recognized until they're no longer present. Not because they suddenly became more valuable, but because the absence created awareness, and awareness created appreciation. But here's something important. This only works when genuine value already exists. Absence doesn't create value from nothing. It reveals value that was already there. If nobody notices when something disappears, that sends a different message entirely, because absence magnifies what exists. It doesn't invent it. And once you understand that, you stop measuring your importance by constant visibility, because sometimes being noticed less often creates a stronger impression than being seen every day. 10. The strongest influence is the one nobody notices. Most people imagine influence as something obvious: pressure, persuasion, arguments, commands, someone trying to actively change another person's mind. But the most effective influence rarely looks like that. In fact, the strongest influence often goes completely unnoticed, because the moment people feel manipulated, they resist. The moment people feel controlled, they push back. The moment people notice influence, their defenses activate, which means obvious influence is usually the weakest kind. Real influence works differently. It shapes conditions, not decisions. It influences attention, not conclusions. It guides perception, not behavior directly. And because it operates in the background, people experience the outcome as their own choice. That's what makes it powerful. Think about it. The most persuasive conversation you've ever had probably didn't feel persuasive at all. The person wasn't forcing anything. They weren't arguing aggressively. They weren't demanding agreement. They simply guided the interaction in a way that made certain conclusions feel natural. And natural conclusions rarely trigger resistance because they feel self-generated. The human mind protects its independence. People want to believe they arrived at decisions themselves. And most of the time, they genuinely believe they did, even when countless invisible factors influence the process. Timing, framing, emotion, attention, context, expectation, all quietly shaping perception beneath awareness. That's why awareness matters so much. Not because it makes you suspicious of everyone, but because it helps you recognize what is influencing you before the outcome is already decided. Even when countless invisible factors influence the process: timing, framing, emotion, attention, context, expectation, all quietly shaping perception beneath awareness. That's why awareness matters so much. Not because it makes you suspicious of everyone, but because it helps you recognize what is influencing you before the outcome is already decided. And once you can see those forces, they lose much of their power. Because influence works best in darkness. Awareness brings light, and light changes everything. If you've made it this far, you've probably realized something important. Most human behavior isn't random. Most conversations aren't as simple as they appear. And most decisions don't happen the way we think they do. Beneath every interaction, there are patterns. Patterns of attention, patterns of emotion, patterns of perception, patterns of timing. Quiet forces shaping outcomes long before anyone notices they're happening. And the people who consistently navigate life well aren't always the smartest people in the room. They aren't always the strongest. They aren't always the most charismatic. Very often, they are simply the most aware. They notice things others overlook. They recognize patterns others ignore. They understand when attention is being guided, when urgency is being manufactured, when emotion is shaping judgment, when perception is becoming reality. And because they can see those things, they don't get pulled around by them as easily. That's the real purpose of understanding psychology. Not controlling other people. Understanding yourself. Understanding the forces acting on your decisions. Understanding the invisible patterns shaping everyday life. Because the moment you can see a pattern, You stop becoming unconsciously controlled by it. And that's where real freedom begins. Not in controlling others, but in recognizing what's trying to control you. If this video made you think differently about even one conversation you've had recently, then it already did its job. Because awareness starts with a single realization, a single moment where you begin seeing what was always there. And once you see it, it's very difficult to unsee it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments which psychological pattern surprised you the most. I read every comment. Stay aware, stay observant, and I'll see you in the next video. Farewell.